Okay, everyone, welcome to Magnolia United Church of Christ November Learning Forum, tonight brought to you by Humanities of Washington. My name is Marcy Scott Weiss. I'm the senior pastor here at MUCC, and I'm moderating tonight's event. And we'd like to begin by acknowledging that we present this program from the traditional lands of the Duwamish peoples and who have stewarded this land for generations. This presentation you're about to enjoy is part of Humanities of Washington's Speakers Bureau's programs. Humanities of Washington's is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. And thanks to support from the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at WSU, and generous private donors. Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state and offer these Zoom services. And I'm going to put the link to their website, and I encourage you to check them out. This organization, like many organizations in our country, have been significantly impacted by reductions as a result of cuts to the national endowments for the arts, and they do incredible work. So I'll put that link to their website in the chat discussion. Now, a quick note on civil discourse. The Speakers Bureau program is designed to generate an open and honest conversation on many topics, some of which may be controversial. And we encourage differing perspective and viewpoints, but we also ask that you treat this topic, the speaker, and each other with respect. And also please note that this event is being recorded. Okay, a bit about our speaker this evening. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Carolyn Long, an associate professor at Washington State University, Vancouver's School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. Dr. Long's research focuses on American politics, policy, and law. She's the author of Mapp versus Ohio, Guarding Against Unreasonable Searches and Seizures, and Religious Freedom and Indian Rights, the case of Oregon versus Smith. And she's the recipient of 2 Fulbright Scholar Awards. Tonight, Dr. Long is going to be speaking for about 40 minutes on the topic of shame in American politics. And then we're going to have time for questions at the end. If you do have a burning question, please use the chat for that, but otherwise we're going to hold questions till the end, and I'll be monitoring the chat if you need anything during the presentation. During our question and answer time, I'm also going to post an evaluation in the comment section, and we'd really appreciate it if you all would fill that out. That's very helpful for Humanities of Washington. And again, this session is being underwritten by a grant from Humanities of Washington. So I thank them for that. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Long and say thank you so much for Dr. Long for being here with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Marcy, and a big thanks to the Magnolia United Church of Christ for hosting this evening's talk, but also your hosting several talks from Humanities Washington over time. I think it's fantastic, and I'm glad that we can do this via Zoom. This is my first Zoom talk, so I apologize if it's clumsy, but I'm learning along with you. I'm glad that we have this opportunity to talk. And I appreciate the kind introduction, and a big thank you to Humanities Washington on my behalf as well. Before I begin, just a quick caveat. The views that I'm offering this evening are my own and not representative of Washington State University, Vancouver. So the use of shame as a weapon in American politics has been occurring for years. And it has had mixed effect in terms of changing people's behavior. And one of the things I'm going to argue this evening is that when the shame is actually used by people in power, it actually has the opposite effect. It makes people angrier about politics. And today we see shameless behavior by politicians all of the time, and it is also being weaponized, which is problematic. problematic. One of the effects of this in this polarized and heightened partisanship time that we have is that it makes it more difficult for people to talk about issues, more difficult to disagree honestly about issues, and very challenging to communicate effectively. One of the things I was speaking to Marcy about as we were setting up is that people have a tendency to look at the increase in shamelessness in politics and blame a particular politician. But one of the things I'll show is that this is something that has been happening for a very long time, and I'll explain why it's problematic. So I have three parts to the talk today. My slide's not working, so hold on a second, Marcy. It's not advancing, so now I'm very concerned here. It advanced earlier.
Do you have it expanded so it's taking up the whole?
I do not, but let me try that.
Yeah.
Slide only. I've got Zoom. This is my panicked time.
Okay, we'll get it. We'll get it.
Okay, slide. Still not working. I'm going to stop and do it again, if that's okay. Please,
Yep.
I apologize. This is my greatest nightmare, but I think we'll try to fix it here. Let's try it again. This and share.
And is it full screen?
It is. This might work. Okay. Ah, Eureka. Apologies. Okay. So this is a speech that has three parts. Part one, I'll provide definitions so that we're all on the same page. Part two, I'll look at shame and shamelessness in American politics and how it's used. And then in part three, I'm going to speak about the weaponization of shame. So part one, what is shame? Why do we shame? And does shaming work? First, I think it's important to begin with definitions so we are all on the same page. So one of the things that I like to compare shame to is embarrassment. We've all been embarrassed at one time or another. You forget to zip your trousers. You have a piece of toilet paper on your shoe, or as the slide indicates, maybe you pass gas in front of others. Your face grows red. You chuckle sometimes because you want people to think that you're laughing with them. Sometimes you make a self-deprecating remark. But embarrassment is defined as a feeling of awkwardness or self-consciousness. It's often because of something that we did, and usually it's something that we did unintentionally. And the embarrassment feeling is usually fleeting, and we recover quickly from it. And then there's guilt. Guilt, like shame, is something that we've probably all experienced in our life. You did something that you shouldn't. Maybe you committed an act of infidelity. Maybe you broke a traffic law. Maybe you were caught cheating on your taxes. You may even feel guilt for fairly benign reasons. We have New Year's Eve coming up soon, and we all seem to make resolutions, and we don't often meet them. With guilt, it's pretty obvious that you've broken some sort of rule or norm. You've been caught by it, and you feel badly. So guilt is defined as an emotion one feels based on something that they've done. It is often an emotional response to an act. We've done something bad. We've assessed how it measures up to our values. We find ourselves lacking. We feel that physiological discomfort, and that discomfort may be strong enough that it deters a future act. Usually with guilt, you apologize, you make amends, you may even be a better person after the incident in order to sort of make up for what you've done in some cosmic universe. But the nice thing about guilt is that it is adaptive and even helpful because we learn from our mistakes, we isolate the bad behavior, and we try to change it. And then there's shame. And there. If you're familiar with Brene Brown, who's done a lot of writing on it, I think she provides us an excellent definition. Shame is defined as that intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. People who feel shame feel, I am bad, I'm a mess, And the focus is on themselves, not on their behavior or the act that they've done. And the result of it is that we feel alone, and it's never known to change behavior in the future, which is something that I'm going to come back to. Oxford English Dictionary defines shame as well as that painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by a consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. So Brene Brown and the dictionary are essentially referring to the fact that shame as an emotion can feel very toxic. It's painful to feel shame. We experience it physiologically, so we have a physical reaction, but we also have a lasting sort of cognitive or mental reaction to what we've done. It sticks with us, whereas embarrassment and guilt, as I mentioned, is fairly fleeting. So if you look at these three emotions between embarrassment, guilt, and shame, we find out with embarrassment, you get that awkward feeling, it's fleeting. With guilt, we focus on a bad act, but we think that our behavior can be adaptive, we can change. We apologize, we make amends. But with shame, it goes a step further and you feel bad about yourself, or somebody makes you feel bad about yourself. And so it's a tricky emotion because it focuses on you rather than an act or an action. There are a number of characteristics of shame. Some characteristics are that it is learned, so it requires an awareness of others. So, for instance, I'm having problems with my PowerPoint presentation. I feel embarrassment, maybe a little bit of guilt that I hadn't figured it out, but I haven't felt shame yet. But I would learn to feel shame if somebody talked to me after the speech and said, listen, you should have had this taken together, figured out, you're a professor, you should know how to do PowerPoint. That would show that I feel shame because I've learned it from someone else. Shame is also a private and a social emotion. As a private emotion, shame reflects how we feel about ourselves, who we are, what we value. It is also a public emotion, a public or a social emotion, in that it is something that is shared with others. It is used to enforce social norms in a community. It regulates our behavior. And then the fear of shame is something that we try to avoid. And in society, the threat of shame really reflects an obligation to the norms and standards of the community, which is something that I'll speak about a little bit later. I mentioned that shame is deeply personal. Again, if you go back to Brene Brown's definition, she talks about it being this intensely personal feeling or painful feeling of believing that we are flawed. So you can see it really is about oneself rather than an act. As a result of that, it's very hard on one's ego. Kathy O'Neill, who wrote a book about shame, said that shame packs a vicious punch. Shame provokes a holistic negative self-evaluation. If we experience guilt, we say, what a terrible thing that I did. The person experiencing shame, on the other hand, often says, what a horrible person I am. So it's deeply personal and also hard on one's ego. And it's hard on one's ego because it can be mentally and even physically debilitating. Brene Brown, who's done work in this, has talked about how shame is highly correlated with some unfavorable behaviors, such as addiction, violence, aggression. It can even lead to suicide because people bully you because of something that you've done. And it is because people feel that they are bad because of the reaction that people are having towards them. So it also becomes uniquely hard on one's ego because we become very self-defensive of our feelings. So if we think that we're going to be shamed or there's a possibility of shame for what we are saying or doing, we sometimes actually circle the wagons around ourselves and we become more resistant to changing our behavior because we're reacting to that shame. So what does the research say? Most of the work on shame is obviously done by psychologists and social psychologists. Psychologists who study shame talk about how it's personally damaging because it's highlighting the discrepancy between how we feel about our ideal self and our actual self. So we think that we are a good person. We've done something which creates this emotion of shame. And so that gap between the two is one of the reasons why it's so hard on our ego. Sociologists and social psychologists who study shame focus on sort of the external implications of shame. And what those implications are is things like losing respect within a community, having your reputation suffer, maybe you fall from favor among your circle of friends. And social psychologists also focus on the damaging effects of shame because of the despondency or depression people feel, or self-harm, hatred towards one another, social withdrawal. One of the things that they've also noticed is that when you feel shame, there is a tendency to take that shame and try to project it onto another person, to try to get rid of it. So you circle the wagons, but you also try to get rid of it in some way. And often that shame is directed at the person doing the shaming, or it's directed at somebody who's more vulnerable, who you can sort of blame for that behavior. So, what are some observations about shame, including why we do it? Because the reality is it happens and has happened historically, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. So, I'd like to talk about why we shame, whether it works, and why it can be used, some would argue, for a benefit or an advantage. So, why do we shame? One of the main reasons why we shame is to call attention to someone's bad acts or to reinforce societal norms. And we find that sometimes these are really benign things that people do that then subjects them to shame. But the important thing is that we are sort of trying to reinforce a community's expectations. The best example of this is somebody who's behaved in an objectively terrible way. Maybe you've seen on YouTube or on social media somebody who is yelling at a customer service representative, or maybe a service worker. Maybe it's somebody who's having a meltdown on an airplane because something went awry. Somebody captures it on a camera or on a video. Essentially, what's happening is that people are sort of looking at somebody and shaming them and trying to reinforce the fact that you shouldn't treat people badly. You shouldn't behave badly on an airplane. So that's one reason. The second reason, which is related, is that some people shame in order to motivate individuals to accept responsibility for their actions, and maybe even take reparative action in response. So you're sort of calling attention to the bad act, and in so doing, you're hoping that the person that is being shamed recognizes that bad act and tries to not do it in the future. It is true that sometimes people are doing things unwittingly and they become subject of shame from others, but the people who are shaming often don't know that you're doing something unwittingly or unintentionally, so they don't hold their shame back. They actually continue to do it. Shame can also be a deterrent to bad behavior, not only for the individual being shamed, but for others who may be viewing your actions and then viewing the reactions of others. So the threat of shame is sort of like the Damocles sword hanging over you. People will want to avoid this emotion. And so the argument is that that threat of shame makes them improve their behavior, behave better. So shame can be used in that way. Shame to deter people's bad behavior is oftentimes the motivation for somebody who's doing the shaming. And I'd like you to think about that as we continue talking this evening when I ask you to think about a time when maybe you've experienced shame. When it gets a little bit more noxious, shame is used as a means of social control. So it can be used to empower the person doing the shaming, but also if you're empowering one, you're potentially oppressing another. So shame can be used as a weapon to control or to disempower individuals, maybe because they don't abide by social norms, maybe because they are vulnerable to shame because of their position in society, but it's really used to control people's behavior. And then finally, one thing that we've noticed in the research is that shame is something that people will do as a shamer to make themselves feel better about themselves. So if you don't feel good about yourself, you may have a tendency to shame others. And this is something that we see happening in this very polarized political climate. And oftentimes when it's done, where somebody is shaming another to feel good about themselves, they do it because others will also agree with their shaming. And so you end up coming bound together with other like-minded people. Because when shame is used in this way, they are not trying to change somebody's behavior or reinforce societal norms. They're actually doing it for their own benefit. And that's something that I'm going to argue we see increasingly in politics today. They do it because shame as an emotion provides a psychological payoff to the person doing the shaming. One of the best examples of this is social media. If you've ever had the misfortune of being involved in the comments section of any news story or video that you watch, one of the things that you see is this digital pile-on where everybody is, being very critical of what they've seen or what they've heard. They get very personal in their responses, and people have a tendency to pile on. So suddenly a person is getting this wave of negativity, and it makes them feel shame. So whenever you express indignation in a post, you feel better about yourself because the outrage satisfies you. We experience those feelings of Schadenfreude. And we may know this, and it may be one of the reasons why we shame. So that is an example of how shame can become a group project. And the reason I point it out is it then means that the sort of the toxicity of shame has a multiplier effect because suddenly many people are involved in the shaming. Myra Mendebel, who's done some work in this area, has a great quote, which is, nothing fosters the illusion of solidarity like shared condemnation. She goes on to say, shaming fills in for the spectacles that were once the town square stocks and pillories. So she's talking about the motivation of individuals to shame. So why is it different today? Obviously, social media is one of the culprits, but I would argue that because of our partisan and polarized environment, that contributes to opportunities to shame others, and then you get those digital pile-ons that happen. So I think one of the things that we can look at is historical examples of shame. I'm not going to talk about politics now, but I'm going to give you some examples that we can probably identify with when we see shame being used historically. So if we look at shame being used to call attention to those bad acts or reinforce social norms, I think this is the great example. It happened in medieval Europe, but we also in colonial America saw how Puritans would punish people publicly. So here's an example of a stock. It's being used to make an example of the individual, to reinforce norms, and potentially to try to control future behavior. Another example is, of course, the pillory, which is done for the same reasons. The purpose, again, is to enforce those societal norms and enforce conformity, keep people in line. And then I think this is the best example, which shows a pillory, which is kind of interesting because they have multiple people on the pillory. But the reason why I like this slide is I ask people to look at the crowd, not the person being shamed. The crowd becomes a participant in the shame of the individuals. It's a public event. I think people are throwing vegetables. You see children there. This is an example of where the community comes together with the intent to shame another. It's a public ritual. So when looking at the use of shame as a norm, there are plenty of examples, and how bad it is ranges. It can range from something fairly benign to something very cruel. Let me provide a few more examples. So this would be an example of where, in order to enforce the societal norm of apparently what you wear to the seaside back in the day, if you were to not have this full clothed approach to swimming, people would probably shame you because this was a norm. And this is another example. So this is the use of dunce caps in the day. And so you can see that in the larger slide, the student not only has the cap, but he's being sort of excluded from the community, his classmates, and being forced to be in a corner. On the bottom right, I think they upped the ante a bit, and you have an example of not only the dunce cap, but also I think it's the donkey ears to sort of provide an impression perception that they've not only misbehaved, but maybe they're not very bright. And then in the upper right corner, you see how the instructor is also, involved in the shaming quite obviously in front of other students. And then it can be very cruel, although some people believe that this is a good idea. This is a sentence that a judge imposed upon a woman who had stolen from a store. And the punishment was for the community to see her bad act and to see how she's being humiliated in front of others in hopes of deterring future bad acts. So these are just three little examples that I thought would just call attention to things that might appear benign, but if you dig a little bit deeper, you can see that the intention of shaming is to really call the community's attention to what they feel is a violation of social norms. So, what about shame as a means of social control? Something I mentioned earlier is that shame has been used as a tool of oppression historically, usually directed at vulnerable individuals or people who are powerless. For years, we've seen shame be used as a tool of oppression for women, people of color, the disabled, the poor. And many civil rights movements actually challenged the orthodoxy of some of the norms that were being imposed on society. One example of this in literature is from Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter. And so I'm sure you're familiar with the story, but Hawthorne is calling attention, obviously, to Hester Prynne and her adulterous affair and giving birth to a child, and showing that the A was a way in which the community was trying to shame her. But if you dig a little bit deeper into what Hawthorne is talking about in this novel, he really is talking about how shame is not good because not only is she being singled out, but he's calling attention to the fact that the minister who impregnated her, who kept his role secret, retains his honor and standing in the community. So he's looking at the hypocrisy of shaming Prynne in this particular example. So by highlighting the community's need to shame, Hawthorne is really making clear that this shaming of her is not fair, and he wants to actually redirect the shame, if you should have it used at all, to the others who are responsible. So think about shame and yourself for just a moment. Perhaps you yourself have shamed others. Maybe you have been the victim of shame. Certainly, if you've been active on social media, you've seen this take place. If I were to poll you or ask you if you had experienced this yourself, it's likely that you have, but also likely that you wouldn't want to share it. And the reason why is that people do not like to share the fact that they have felt shame because it is such a humiliating and difficult emotion to deal with. So it sort of leads to the question as to whether or not shaming is ever appropriate. Has shaming ever been used in order to change behavior? Has it ever been used to a positive effect? Essentially, does it work? So I want to give you a few examples historically where some people have argued that it could be efficacious in maybe changing people's minds or at least getting them to pause and think about what's happening. So here's one example. This is a flyer from the NAACP. And the flyer is essentially calling attention to the terrible problem of lynching in the South. So the flyer indicates how many people have suffered because of this violent act, but also goes on to say at the bottom of the flyer about how, because this is happening, the solution is legislative, that maybe the way to address lynching is to call attention to it. And you can't see here, but you can, if you were to look at the small print, you would see that some people, of course, were lynched for very minor offenses. But the solution, according to the group, would be legislation to try to outlaw shaming. So the argument is this might be a good use of shame because this group is calling attention to a terrible act, one that has to be remedied, and they're also offering the remedy. Maybe a better example here is a second flyer that they put out where the same statistics are provided, but at the very end, they're talking about how you, in bright capital letters, can't escape your responsibility, essentially saying this is happening. there are solutions available. And really, to maintain civilization in America, as the flyer says, you have to be aware that this is going on. You have an obligation to try to address it. So that's an example that we see. There are others. If you are familiar with environmental politics, you may be aware of what's known as the Dirty Dozen. And this is an example of environmental groups that will look at who the biggest corporate polluters are, will publish this information. And the intention of doing so is to sort of call attention to the bad acts of a business or a corporation in hopes that people may take that information and maybe not patronize those businesses, maybe invite criticism of them, maybe help them want to join your cause. But they're essentially using shame to attack corporations or businesses because of what they're doing. We see this as well in international. We see this as well in politics. This is a slide about the federal income rate. And so what this group was trying to do was to illustrate that people pay taxes. Nobody likes paying taxes, but if you compare how Americans pay taxes to what corporations do or businesses, they pay such a lower rate for a variety of reasons. And this intention here is to try to shame them into not doing their fair part in terms of taxing to help support services that government will provide. Another example, and I don't have a slide for this, is in international politics. Comparative political scientists speak about how human rights organizations use something called naming and shaming, where what they will do is they will call attention to countries that are engaged in human rights abuses as a way of telling the global society that these countries are really doing terrible things. And they're doing it to call attention to those acts, but also hopefully to highlight the human rights abuses so that people will try to get involved to change them. We saw this, of course, in South Africa during the anti-apartheid movement, decades ago, but this still happens all the time where we will call out countries, where activists will call out countries for what they're doing. It is also true that when this happens, when people shame organizations or businesses or countries, that sometimes it doesn't work out so well, and there can be a backlash to that shame. The best example I have is from World War I in Britain, and this is a slide about the Order of the White Feather. I'm not sure you're familiar with this group, but it was founded in Britain in 1914 as a strategy to encourage young men to enlist in the war effort. So when enlistment was lagging behind, there was conversation among people who belonged to the Order of White Feather to try to do something about it. So they would take a white feather to a young man who was out in public, and they would put it in his lapel to sort of call attention to the fact that they were choosing not to enlist. So it was an effort to try to shame them into becoming soldiers to fight for the country. But the backlash occurred when they started doing this indiscriminately. And so they would put white feathers in the lapels of veterans who had already served, or they would put the lapel, would put the feather in the lapel of somebody who couldn't serve. And so people started to get very indignant about this response. It led to a backlash and showed how problematic it can be. And then a little closer to home and a little bit more recent, I don't think we can forget COVID and the fact that many people were shamed if they weren't following societal norms. Perhaps you found yourself looking side-eyed at somebody who wasn't wearing a mask, or who coughed in public, or maybe somebody who wasn't social distancing. There were all examples of little shaming tendencies that we used to try to get people to comply with societal norms in the interest of public safety. People were hoarding toilet paper, all sorts of things were going on. And so you probably felt justified. But at the same time, there could be some ill effects of that. The best example is this website that I found during the height of COVID called Sorry Anti-Vaxxer. And this was a young man who came up with this idea to highlight stories of individuals who had chose not to get vaccinated, and then had caught COVID. Some of them passed, some of them became very, very ill. And so he would create a web page that captured their previous comments about vaccinations, would talk about how they got COVID and how they died. So you can see how cruel this was. Even if people have specific and very strong views about vaccination, sort of making fun of somebody after they've passed from a choice that they made shows how cruel it can be. And so these are instances where we see shame outside of politics. Hopefully, they are instances that you are familiar with, and maybe you say to yourself, "These aren't so bad if you're just, enforcing social norms." But again, I want you to think about the toxicity of this. It has led to circumstances where scholars are looking at whether or not there are circumstances where shaming might, in fact, be effective in changing people's behavior. A book that came out this year by David Keene is called Shame, the Politics and Power of an Emotion. And he speaks about how shame has been used historically and gives suggestions on when shaming might be effective. And it really is along the lines of the person being shamed having respect for the person doing the shaming. It's how people shame. Is it a website calling attention to the passing of a loved one? Or is it maybe a gentle reminder to someone that you probably shouldn't yell at a service worker? It also depends, Keene tells us, about what somebody is being shamed about. If you're being shamed about something that you cannot change, so maybe your looks, maybe your socioeconomic status, maybe your race, your ethnicity, when you're shaming somebody for something that they don't have any control over, I would argue that's especially cruel because you certainly can't change their behavior. So it seems the only motivation for doing it is to make somebody feel bad about themselves. So Keene doesn't necessarily say that we should shame, but he is trying to look at ways in which shaming may have led to a change in people's behavior. And so one of the things that he concludes, and other scholars in this area, is that shame may be used effectively if it is against an institution, yet like the corporate polluters, or a high-profile person who has power, like a politician. Kathy O'Neill, who I quoted earlier, said maybe shame can be used to punch up but not punch down. I mean, maybe it's more acceptable if it's somebody who is in that position of authority who shouldn't be behaving badly, and shame may actually lead to an opportunity to try to influence their behavior. That leads me to part two of the talk, which is shame in American politics. So I want to move now to the political realm and talk about what shame looks like in politics, look at whether or not we're living in a post-shame era, and whether the shamelessness of individuals in positions of power is a problem, and if so, why it's a problem. What I usually do here is show a videotape. I spoke with Marcy about this, and we're going to put the address of the videotape in the chat, but it's a small clip from OPB that captures McCarthyism. And the clip is of Joseph Welch, who you see in the left, and that's McCarthy in the right, having an exchange which led to his quote in the title for the talk, which is, "Have you no decency, sir? At long last, have you no sense of decency?" And the story behind this was that McCarthy and Welch had come up with an agreement during the McCarthy hearings. This is the Senate hearings, and Welch was an attorney. They had come up with an agreement that McCarthy would not raise the name of one of Welch's staffers, somebody who worked at his law firm. He was a young man. He had at one point been then casually involved in communism, in sort of looking into it. And McCarthy had agreed that he would not raise the issue in the public hearing. But then he did. Because he felt cornered by some of the things that Welch was saying. And that led to a very famous exchange. And it was actually very effective. And it was really effective because of something that it doesn't happen today, which is you had a lot of people watching the McCarthy hearings. There were very few broadcast media channels, and so they didn't have a choice to watch all the other things that are on TV. And McCarthy was an easy target because he had behaved so badly during these hearings towards individuals. And so people have argued that it was an opportunity where a little bit of shame changed the trajectory of McCarthyism. I mean, shortly after this exchange, McCarthy's sort of status in politics declined. He became very ill. He passed shortly thereafter. And so some people point to this as an example where shaming might be useful. So, how do we see shame in politics more recently? So, how do we see it today? Usually, we see shame used against politicians when a politician has done something because of some fall from grace. Usually, it's extremely unethical or illegal behavior. Maybe it's something in their personal lives like marital infidelity. Maybe it's financial fraud or self dealing. They've done something wrong. The story in the scandal is amplified by the press. And then most of the politicians are disgraced and they choose to voluntarily step aside from politics out of contrition. So they're reacting to the shame that they're feeling because of the public attention on their bad acts. And so when this happens, it usually in politics plays out three ways. The first way is a politician will hold a tearful press. Sorry, I'm getting away from this. And now this happens. All right. This is the video that I'm not showing. And so I'm going to try again to share screens. I'm going to stop. And should I do it again, Marcy? Do you have a recommendation?
Yeah, that seemed to work last time.
Let's do that.
And then just get past that slide.
Okay. So here is what I did. Can you see the slide or have I totally stopped sharing?
Haven't shared yet.
It's not shared yet. Okay, let me get back here and do this. Share screen. Back to screen, back to share. Elliot Spitzer. So here's an example of a politician who holds that hastily called press conference. If you're not familiar with him, Democrat Elliot Spitzer spent tens of thousands of dollars on prostitutes. It was called out in the press. He calls a press conference, his dutiful wife by his side, resigns from office, and sort of moves away from the public sphere. So that's one way that it plays out. A second way it plays out is a politician may resign preemptively, knowing that they are going to be investigated, and they are choosing rather than to deal with an investigation and a potential impeachment, that they will just resign preemptively. An example here. An example here is of Larry Craig, who I can't show. So let's try this again. I'm so sorry about this. Okay, hold on a moment.
And you have it fully expanded?
I'll try that again. Let's see.
I think it did.
Full screen. Zoom. Stop share. Go back. Is it sharing again?
Yeah, it's on the Elliot Spitzer slide.
Okay. Try a second one, but it's not doing this. Oh my word. What a grand experience. What a grand experiment this is. Okay. Let's try this again.
If this doesn't work, I wonder if we try sharing from the slide you want to be on.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm just thinking really quickly. Oh, okay. I get so excited when it works. I think this is the last time it will. Former Senator Larry Craig, a Republican from Idaho. This is an example of what happened with him. You may recall that he was arrested for indecent behavior in a men's restroom in an airport. He was soliciting an undercover police officer. He was arrested for a misdemeanor. Nobody paid any attention to it because it wasn't in the news. But then suddenly it hit the news. He was seen as a hypocrite because of some of his positions on policy issues dealing with LGBTQ positions. So he resigns from office. I will add that he later stayed in office until the end of his term, but he didn't want the attention, and so he sort of withdrew the guilty plea, left the public eye for a period of time in order to avoid those feelings of shame. The third thing that happens is there's no press conference, there's no short there's no resigning preemptively. There's just a short press statement where somebody says they want to spend more time with their family. If that happens, I assure you, there is other things that are happening there. There are many, many examples of politicians behaving badly. I only have about 40 minutes, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But we can see in these instances that these are people in power. They've done something badly. They're getting public attention, and they are being shamed in the hopes that the people doing the shaming are trying to get them to change their behavior or to not do something in the future. With these examples, the one thing I do want to point out is that they are usually about politicians who have those positions of power. They are people who are voluntarily putting themselves in the public eye. They're competing for the honor of representing you as your representative or your senator. And so some people would argue that this would be an example of punching up because they have power and you're trying to call them to account. But what if politicians behave badly and they don't resign? There are plenty of examples of this. Robert Menendez was investigated for years for bribery, chose to stay in office until I think about close to the time that he was going to go to prison. Matt Gaetz, I think you may be familiar with his saga, is somebody who was accused of having relationships with underage young women, received a lot of attention, stayed in office for as long as he could, and only resigned when he thought he was going to be appointed to a higher office by this administration. We don't have to look too far back to see that politicians behaving badly happens even at the top. You probably recall President Clinton and his scandal involving an intern who worked in his office. And then, of course, there are examples of President Trump behaving in a way that people find is actually shameful. So there are plenty of examples of shameless politicians. Some people argue that the shamelessness of their behavior appears to be on the rise, and that folks using shame to try to get them to change their behavior is not having an effect. It is true that shamelessness in politics has always existed. It's not just a single person or a single political party, but it doesn't take a political scientist to show that we're seeing with increased frequency politicians who aren't resigning with disgrace, aren't actually apologizing for their behavior, but rather they're leaning into their behavior and they're doing so unapologetically, which leads to the conclusion of some that we've entered this post-shame era in American politics, where we don't expect politicians to act with contrition. Instead, we expect them to double down and continue behaving badly. And so if you can suffer through a political campaign, if you can suffer through the endless fundraising that you have to do, or being the joke, the butt of jokes from late night comedians, there are even some people who would argue that shamelessness is a positive trait in politics, that it can get you to go far. That maybe you have some sort of Darwinian advantage because you're not going to feel shame for the behavior, your bad behavior, and that you will be able to stay in office and be successful. And certainly when we look at shamelessness in American politics, we are finding increasingly that there really is little cost to bad behavior. In the past, if you were caught lying, in the past, if you were caught being a hypocrite or flip-flopping your positions, the media would amplify the scandal. And people would actually try to change their behavior to avoid having their scandal be amplified. But now we're finding out that there's little cost to behaving shamelessly. We're also finding out that some people believe that there are benefits to acting shamelessly, that it gives them power. And we're seeing this with the breakdown in certain institutional norms, especially in politics. So, one example was provided about 12 years ago when a representative named Joe Wilson yelled during President Obama's State of the Union address, "You lie." I don't know if anybody remembers it, but it was a really powerful moment because we really, frankly, had not seen that in American politics, sort of yelling at a president during a State of the Union address. Well, we found out that Joseph Wilson was able to raise $1 million when he sort of told his supporters that he was holding the president to account. So it raised his profile, but it also created this perverse incentive where you can monetize your outrage and your supporters will give you funding, will give you resources if you do something like challenge somebody in such a public way. So to conclude this part, I would just mention that every day, unfortunately, we are reminded of shameless politicians behaving badly because it makes good copy or makes good viewing. And ironically, the media amplifies the shameless behavior, which then may ironically be encouraging others to behave in a shameless way. So they get the media attention and maybe the fundraising. So we get caught in this endless cycle of vitriol where somebody says or does something outlandish, the media covers it by saying it's newsworthy. And so that's what we see on television rather than politicians behaving well. It's bad because of the way we have cable media and they need to fill the time. And it, of course, is amplified as well by the use of social media and that digital pile on that I talked about. So why is this problematic? Why have I made it the subject of our talk? And why do I think it's a dangerous trend that we're seeing in American politics? There are a couple of reasons. The main is it reinforces the impression that many Americans have that politicians are liars. Public approval ratings for politicians is at an all-time low. It is lower than used car salesmen, we like to say, and that's actually an insult to used car salesmen. And so it sort of reinforces this. When we call attention to bad acts, everybody thinks that all politicians, all people working in the public sector are ones who behave this way, and that's problematic. It contributes to political polarization and partisanship. Polarization is something that we've been noticing in politics since 1994, and it has increased over time. And right now we're seeing something called negative partisanship, where instead of sort of trying to persuade people that you are a good politician or that your policy ideas are good, you get farther if you just attack the other person and you attack the other person's ideas. That actually gets you more support from your core supporters, and that's problematic. The other thing that we see happening is people start to lose faith in our public institutions, confidence in our institutions that is an all-time low as well. If you are interested in statistics in this area, if you go and look at Pew does great research in this area and just shows that it's eating away at our trust and our confidence in institutions, in politics, but other institutions. Right now, we're seeing that people are not trusting institutions of higher education. And it's because of the way people are talking about issues that affect folks there. And so that could be very problematic. And then it can lead to people becoming very apathetic. So folks become less involved in political conversations, less involved in being civically involved in institutions that aren't even political. And so you see this loss of engagement, this increase in apathy across the board. And then at its most dangerous, it can lead to abuses of power. Because if you're acting in a shameless way, if you're being rewarded rather than penalized for it, people are going to think that they can push it as far as possible. So now we know a little bit about what shame is. We've compared it to other emotions. We know a little bit why people might shame others. We know that shame has been used in the past to hold politicians to account. but at the same time, we've seen an increase in shamelessness. So it's a little bit paradoxical what's happening. But that gets me to the last part of the talk, which is what I call the weaponization of shame. Because what we're seeing is that people who are in power are sort of weaponizing shame as an emotion to really ill effects. So if you look at shame, I've mentioned how it permeates our political discourse. There's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of blaming people for who they are, not for what they stand for. And you're also seeing people in power doing this. So there is this tendency now for if we hear that somebody has a policy position that we disagree with, we will disagree with that position, but we'll go further and we'll attack the person, suggesting that the person is bad because they hold a particular belief. So that the shame is getting to your feeling of yourself as a person, your sense of identity, rather than a genuine, thoughtful disagreement about politics. It's not that your opinion is bad, it's that you are bad. And there are plenty of examples of this in politics. So if you look at certain issue areas like reproductive health or affirmative action, people are really shaming others because of their because not because of the belief they have, but because that they are the one who is offering that belief. So there are plenty of examples. We don't necessarily have sufficient time for it. But one of the things that I mentioned here is that polarization makes it more likely to shame individuals, and that has a lot of difficult and troubling impacts. And so there's an irony here that polarization in politics has now this tendency to make people immune from shame because we are now, speaking mostly with people with whom we agree with rather than having a dialogue. And it's very, very personal. The other thing that's happened, to speed this along a little bit, is we are actually seeing politicians who appear to be using shame. So this is a quote from President Barack Obama, who is speaking about how there were individuals who were getting very angry about politics in certain regions of the country. And so he talks about them clinging to guns or religion. And it was very much showcased as President Obama looking down on individuals. Of course, we can't forget the basket of deplorables. When Hillary Clinton made this unfortunate remark, which seemed to insult half of America. And then there are many examples of President Trump, too many to actually show here, but there are plenty of examples of where people in positions of authority are trying to shame other individuals for who they are. And so you see politicians really attacking individuals as a strategy. So they are exploiting individuals, and sometimes they're exploiting how they feel about issues that they are prideful about, just as a way of trying to get an advantage. So why is this a problem? It's a problem because it tears at the fabric of our society. It's a vicious circle. It limits curiosity. It limits understanding. It narrows the space for people to compromise. It leads to self-censorship. It leads to something called cancel culture, where people are canceled for saying something because folks want to hold them to account. And it also leads to anger, it leads to backlash. So as I mentioned earlier, if people feel shame, they try to get rid of that shame by putting it on others. And they also circle the wagons by way of saying, you're not going to get me to change our mind. And that backlash is a little bit tricky. So let me just mention that it's bad in politics because of these reasons, but also more importantly, it is something that doesn't appear to be going away soon. So finally, some final thoughts. One of the things that I think is important is that we learn to talk about shame. David Keene talks about this as shame management, that we call it out. So that we make people aware that it's a problem, that we learn to identify what I call toxic shame, which is shame that people feel about, or shame that is directed at people who have no control over something, such as a race, ethnicity, gender. That if you find yourself wanting to shame towards a particular end, that you ask yourself whether or not it will actually be effective, because usually it won't. That we avoid the urge to sort of pile on. And this is something that we see in social media. that if somebody's behaving badly, instead of just getting outraged, you instead try to do something to call, not to call attention to the act to shame people, but you try to get people to change behavior by modeling better behavior. And then finally, and always, that you lead with empathy and you think about how if somebody says something or does something that you don't like, maybe it's because you haven't placed yourself in their shoes, and that it's important to do so to maybe understand where they're coming from. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry, my technical difficulties made me run a little bit long, and I skipped over a few things, and I appreciate your tolerance, but I would really love it if we have time to answer questions or have you ask questions if you're able to do so.
Thank you
So
so
I'll hand it over to you, Marcy, while I get rid of this.
much.
I used to end on George Santos, who you may or may not be familiar with, as an example of how sometimes we can actually see the benefits of shame in the sense that he was, of course, drummed out of office and incarcerated. But as many of you know, he was then pardoned recently. So I don't want to end on what I would call a happy note. So I will now pause, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Long. That was an incredible presentation, lots of information. I want to recognize it's 8 o'clock. Folks, please, if you could stick around for questions, we'll go through them. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat. I want to, Gerald asked one at the beginning of your questions, your presentation, when you were talking about the definitions of shame. And the question was, do narcissistic personality disorders react differently to shame from people who do not have that disorder?
Oh my gosh, that is a great question, Gerald. Since I'm not a psychologist or social psychologist, I don't want to get out of my paint, but I would say that it seems pretty obvious that if you have that narcissistic personality disorder, that you probably are fairly immune from shame because you have such a high opinion of yourself. It's all about you. You could do no wrong. So I would say that you will see it disproportionately in individuals who have that disorder. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay. And I want to also draw everyone's attention that I did put the link to the speaker evaluation in the comment section. If y'all could take a moment to do that, that would be greatly appreciated by Humanities of Washington. And if you have questions, you want to put them in the comment section, feel free to do that, or feel free to come off of mute. Lots of beautiful accolades for you, Dr. Long, in the comment section. And I do have a question, and I
Yes.
hate even raise it, but I'm going to say it. The Epstein files.
Yes.
I'm going to raise it. There's something that happened this week that about shame that just kind of baffled me, which is that I assumed everything related to the Epstein files would be shame. It would be, shaming, right?
Yeah.
And then Megyn Kelly did something very interesting, which she kind of tried to redefine shame by talking about the fact that it wasn't so bad because the girls were 15 and 14. And she said it's not like they were 5 or 10, right? So
Yeah.
it's almost like she tried to redefine shame.
Yeah.
So it's like I don't even know what the word is, like unshamed.
Yeah, or explained away somebody's behavior at the very least. I didn't watch the clip, but I did read it in the newspaper, so I didn't hear the full account.
Yeah.
But I do think she was trying to excuse maybe the behavior of some of the individuals who were involved by trying to come up with a false divide between somebody who's very, very young and somebody who's a little bit older, but still a very young minor. And so I don't understand what the motivation was, but I do think she was trying to at least downplay some of the behavior by not wanting people to classify some of the individuals who have been named and will be named as pedophiles. So I think she was reacting to people talking about how Epstein and others were pedophiles. And so I think it was a real unfortunate misstep on her part. I have to think it also wasn't very effective because of the little bit of the backlash that I've heard. I'm not sure if you've noticed that as well, Marcy, in conversations you've had with people about it.
Well, it would seem like there are certain things in our culture that are kind of like bright lines in regards to shame. And that one really kind of struck me like, wow, I haven't seen anybody try to renegotiate that one. It was really kind of stark, and so it really kind of it resonated around the topic of shame as you were talking tonight. So
And let me add, it will be interesting as we learn more about this individual in the files or whatever. It will be very interesting to see how people react because I would theorize that a substantial number of the population, because of their intense partisanship, will excuse behavior of individuals or they won't believe the information. So I don't think sort of the country's collective shame will be as effective as people think it might be.
okay.
And I say that with regret too, because I think it is universally condemned, or I would hope that it's universally condemned when people, behave in such a damaging way.
Yeah. I want to stop and ask if there are questions from folks who are on the line that want to come off mute and ask a question. I do have another one that for Dr. Long, if you don't. We do. I think we have one. Parents might use shame to control behaviors, as do educators. It seems like a very difficult method to eradicate. What systemic attempts might be effective today? From Cindy.
Oh God, that's a great question. One of the things that I really liked about the Keene book, Cindy, was that what he was trying to do was sort of call attention to the fact that shame is used and the negative effects of it. And so I think talking about it, that was one of the things that I recommended earlier, that we need to speak to parents, we need to speak to educators about how it is something that is a real damaging way to treat another individual. Because I do think that parents and even educators try to use shame because they think that it works. And so I think the best way is to tell people and show people that it doesn't work. And I'll use an example from my own life. I work at a university. There are people of all political stripes at our university. But sometimes I see my peers shame others, not necessarily students, but maybe people in politics and things like that, or they'll call attention to the bad act of a colleague and they'll use shame. And when I've called them on it and I've said, I think that that's a mistake, their response is more often than not, that's okay because I want them to change their behavior. I feel good telling a student that they are potentially a racist because of a term that they use because the term is bad and racists are bad. And I'm like, okay, I accept that as your justification, but I need you to know that what you are doing is going to have exactly the opposite effect. You're not going to change their behavior. They're going to circle the wagons. They may feel a little bit bad about themselves for a moment, but then they're going to be angry and they're going to be more certain of their position. So that's why talking about it, talking about the negative effects of shame is one way to address that problem. I think it's tricky with parents. I'm a parent. I'm sure I've done it myself. And I will say that after, doing work in this area, after, personally seeing it in higher education, I think telling people that it doesn't work and is more dangerous is probably the best thing that we can do. There really is a false impression of people that they think it does work. And as I mentioned, it usually doesn't. Maybe if you're attacking an institution, as I mentioned earlier, like a corporate polluter or a business that's behaving unethically, or maybe somebody in an extreme position of power who has wealth, maybe it has an effect, but more likely than not, it does not.
Dr. Long, there's a request for your slides. Now, I did tell folks that the recording is going to be available on our website. So after tomorrow, you can find the recording and go back and reference it. It's under, if you just pull up www.magnoliaucc.org, pull up our classes and spiritual retreats, and you'll see the recording there. But in regards to your slides, are you?
Oh, I'm happy to provide them. Yes, absolutely. Because there's a lot here, and even though I rushed through the last part of it, there is some explanation on the slides. And also, I mentioned earlier that short video of Joseph Welch. That is embedded in one of the slides, so I'll provide that to Marcy separately as well as the slide deck. Absolutely, of course.
So what I'd say is if you would like the slide and you are not on our Magnolia UCC website, if you'll put your email in the chat section, then we'll get those to you. Okay. Are there any other questions that we have? Okay, Dr. Long, before folks came on, you and I had a conversation about how it's hard to hate folks when you're face to face.
Yes.
And how that so I'm thinking about how do we move forward in a shame-based culture, and in social media in particular, and your comment about it's hard to hate people when you're in front of them. And I'm wondering if there's anything that has been done around that type of incorporation of that component of that face-to-face involvement to kind of do away with the shame component. It's just a
Yes.
simple piece.
Yeah, so not linked to shame, but one of the things that I did work in about a decade ago was in deliberative democracy movement. This is what I was sharing with Marcy earlier, that one of the things that we find when trying to have people find common ground on issues or even talk about difficult issues is to put them around a small table so that they're face to face, to have a few ground rules like the ground rules that started this talk, and then to have a neutral facilitator who is there to guide the conversation in a way that's most productive. So a couple things happen there. The first is you sort of have an impartial umpire. I hate using that word because it's not like they're going to blow the whistle on someone, but the presence of somebody there who's been trained in facilitation helps, even with their body movements, to make sure that they've created an inclusive environment where people can speak honestly and openly with one another, but not do it to the point where they're insulting. And so there's a lot of work that's been done in that area. And I know that I had started an institute at WSU where we would actually do this in communities. So we would take a policy area, like one of them, homelessness. I think somebody mentioned homelessness earlier. It's one of those wicked problems that there isn't a solution to, but everybody has very strong opinions of it. And so when we had people from very different backgrounds intentionally from different backgrounds around a table talking, we would have a series of questions that were intended to sort of gently get them into the conversation to make sure everybody has an opportunity to respond to one another. And it just works really beautifully. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to provide resources about how that's done. There are a lot of groups that have cropped up in the last 20 years that do this sort of work. There's one called Better Angels. There's one group out of the Kettering Institute where they hold public forums that are guided conversations. But many are actually trying to do this to try to bring people together. And what we found, as you mentioned, Marcy, is face to face, but also having ground rules, simple ones like don't respond, listen to understand, don't listen to respond, don't monopolize a conversation. Little things like that really go far into getting people on an equal setting and then equal opportunity to share different ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well then I'm going to just pause for 1 second and just see if there's any final questions. The clarification, it was called Braver Angels, was the
Braver Angels, yeah.
Angels, yeah. Yes, that is correct. And lots of notes of appreciation for you, Dr. Long. Folks saying, yes, they really appreciate it, learned a lot. If you put your email in the comment section, we will get you those slides. So we're going to conclude the presentation in just a minute. So please take a moment now to pop that in there. And let me just say thank you so much, Dr. Long. That was a really, really excellent presentation. And we've done a lot of these Humanities of Washington ones. So really, really great information, especially at this time in our country, where sometimes, honestly, I wake up in the morning and I think, I don't know what to do. And I really appreciate how you brought it to a moment at the end there where there was some hope of how we can take it forward. So I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So.
That's very kind. Well, and thank you for the work that you do. And I hear your congregation as people who have many different perspectives. And if you ever want a primer on how to have good conversations, I'm happy to help. We have ground rules and everything. I love doing it because I'm married to somebody I disagree with frequently. We've learned how to have these difficult conversations ourselves, but modeling the way, as I'm sure you do with your congregants, is also so important. And I think we all have this responsibility to show people that we can disagree without being disagreeable.
Yep. I'm going to end with a beautiful comment for you from Carol Taylor. Love this presentation. I missed it in Vancouver in October as I was out of town. Very happy it was available via Zoom now. Thank you, thank you, thank you! Exclamation
Oh,
point.
super. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Carol. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It's my greatest fear. And so I felt my embarrassment, a little bit of guilt, but I'm nobody shamed me. So I will recover quickly after this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Long. We'll let you go and I'll call it a good night for everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining
Thank
us.
you so much. Have a great evening.
Night.
Bye bye.